Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of April of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about different statements, rumors and different interesting updates from Kiev. And the most important one is that according to pro-Ukrainian sources, Russia is preparing 15 new divisions for large-scale offensive. That was stated by deputy head of Zelensky's office. Russia plans to increase its group in Ukraine by 150,000 people. This is about 50 new motorized rifle divisions, police said. Their formation continues. Russia has no problems with attracting personnel. In the near future, the Russian armed forces will put maximum pressure on those areas where this is possible. The Russian army continues to gradually advance, trying to push through individual sections of the front, having tactical successes. This is a very important statement, and currently we have several deadlines for this offensive operation. Zelensky a few weeks ago reported and told us that Russia will try to start this offensive operation in the late April, so basically within 2 or 3 weeks from this moment. A pro-Ukrainian source reported that the Russians will be able and will have enough of forces, with enough of units, prepared forces and units, only by the late January, by the late July and the early August. So basically in 3-4 months from this moment. Of course, we don't know for sure when exactly the Russians are planning to start, and the most important, we don't know for sure whether these updates are correct and whether these updates is real information, but not something fake. I'm telling you this because we see that the Western countries, especially the United States of America, now currently are trying to create a base, something like a legal base that will allow them to quit this negotiation process, this settlement process in the future, and to blame the Russian Federation that the Russians is the side that broke this entire process. For example, today the Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave his own statement, and he commented this situation with these rumors. US Secretary of State Rubio commented on rumors that Russia is preparing for a new large-scale offensive. If we wake up tomorrow and see the Russians launching some kind of offensive operation, then it will become clear whether they want peace or not. If not, we need to know in advance to adjust our policy, Rubio said. And as you can see, it's very interesting and very tricky statement, because when talking about the current situation along the line of combat contact, we know that the Russians are advancing along the entire line, and in 8 of 10 cases we adjust the map in the Russian favor. Maybe even in 9 of 10 cases we adjust the map in the Russian favor, and just one case for 10 we adjust the map in Ukrainian favor, which means that there is already offensive operation. But when talking about this offensive operation, more precisely about the rate of this offensive operation, we see that everything is okay with the United States of America and the Western countries, which means that there is one important thing that I would like to point to attention. The Western countries, they accept that the Russians are attacking the Ukrainians along the entire line of combat contact, and that the Russians improve their positions from day to day, but for a minimal value. For example, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Lapkova. So this small part was taken by the Russians. According to neutral mappers, the Russians improved their positions, and they're trying to maintain the lines between the settlements of Lugavoye, Жеребянки, Lapkova and Stepovo, just to have better positions before further offensive operation in the direction of Kamianka. So with this situation, the Western countries and the United States of America are okay. So there is no problems. There are no problems with this. There are no problems that the Russians can attack this way, that the Russians can take some territories as a result of such offensives. But for example, if the Russians begin offensive operation as they started in the 2022 at the beginning of the special military operation, then the Western countries and the United States of America will not be okay with this. Or if the Russians began offensive operation as Ukraine Ukrainians began in August of 2024 in the Sumy direction, when every single day the Ukrainians were taking under control 5-6 of villages just a day. So this is something that is not acceptable, and that the Western countries can accept. So now we understand the difference. If the Russians are moving slowly, step by step, then the Western countries have no problems with this. But if the Russians are able to break through the lines, to break through the Ukrainian positions, and to dig in deeper in the territory of Ukraine, this is something that the Western countries will never accept, and they will rearm Ukraine with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to return back everything to the situation when the Russians advance just several, let's say, hundreds meters a day. Anyway, let's continue and let's discuss the situation in the Bogatyr direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in this area, and we see that the Western countries are okay with this progress. If you remember, just yesterday, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the group of forces East managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Veselaya. We are talking about this area. And today, the Russian sources published very interesting video where we can see how Russian soldiers raised flags, their flags on the most northern part of this settlement. So based on this video, we are not adjusting anything because we adjusted the map yesterday, but yesterday we adjusted the map based on the Minister of Defense report, and today we have geolocated proof. Russians established control over this territory. Furthermore, according to different sources, today the Russians continue their offensive operation, and the first Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups entered the southern part of the village by the name of Fedorovka, and different sources reported that there are already clashes for the first buildings in the most southern part of this village. Fedorovka is the last settlement on the Russian way towards the city, towards the village by the name of Kamar. So this is the last village, and if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory and to force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the northern direction, then the Russians will be able to establish complete FPV drone control over the main supply lines that Ukrainians use to support their forces in the villages of Bogatyr and in the village by the name of Alexeyevka to the northeast of the village of Veselaya. So we're talking about this part. When talking about this territory, according to different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to get a bit closer to the village of Bogatyr. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 3rd of April of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 4th of April. We don't have any geolocations that can confirm this. We have several changes on map that were provided us by notes on mappers and by pro-Russian resources, and based on these updates we have adjusted the map just to see the dynamic and to see how exactly the Russians are advancing. The battle for Bogatyr hasn't started yet, but we believe that in the very near future we're gonna start receiving first videos from the outskirts of this settlement and this village as well. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction, because one of the most important updates for the previous 24 hours is coming exactly from this area. Today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the group of forces center managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Uspenovka. This is a very important village, and I'll remind you that the clashes for this territory started around 3 or even 4 months ago. So as you can see, there are just 3 streets, and the clashes for this territory took more than 3 months. I'll remind you that, for example, the battle for the city of Selidovo, which is probably 100 times bigger more than the village of Uspenovka, took around maybe 3 or 4 weeks. So the Russians finished the battle for this territory within a month. And when talking about this small village, the battle for this territory took more than 3 months, because that was very very important and decisive position, very vital position for the Ukrainians, because now they understand that the Russians managed to improve their flanks, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back, suffering losses, and basically the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in this salient between the settlements of Udachne, Kotlina, Shevchenka. Now the Russians have possibilities to improve their logistic through the village of Uspenovka. The Russians can start bringing forces, vehicles, armed personnel carriers, tanks to the north using this village and without any problems from the Ukrainian side. The control over Uspenovka can allow the Russians to rearm their positions between Udachne and Kotlina and to resume their attempts to attack the Ukrainians with the purpose to force them to fall back completely from this territory. With the fall of the village of Uspenovka, the Russians returned or regained initiative almost completely in their hands. We expect that Ukrainians, of course, will try to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to restore control over this village, but something tells me, due to the fact that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation have already reported about this significant progress of the Russians, we believe that Ukrainians lost any chances to regain control over this territory. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Constantinople direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation, and currently the main clashes are taking place in the triangle Novopoltavka, Berezovka and Tarasovka. The Russians are advancing in this area with the purpose to take under control over these three villages, because this is very important for the Russians. This is a strategical position. I'll remind you that just yesterday we got this video where we can see how the Russians managed to destroy the entire minefield as a result of artillery strike. So basically the village of Novopoltavka is unsecured, unprotected by anything, and we believe that currently right now the Russians are attacking this territory. There are very heavy clashes for this village, and maybe during the next several days we're gonna start receiving first reports. Why this position is so important for the Russians? The thing is that this square is, let's say, surrounded by different water barriers. For example, this is the first lake that is located to the northeast of the village of Novopoltavka. This is, for example, another water barrier, another lake or water reservoir that located to the north of Novopoltavka. This is the second, let's say, dense network of rivers and different water reservoirs, let's say, along the entire village of Novopoltavka. And this is another, let's say, complex of water reservoirs to the southwest of Novopoltavka. So as you can see, this territory, this foothold is surrounded by the significant number of water reserves, water barriers, which are something like impossible area that can be passed by regular army. So basically, if the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, are able to establish complete control, let's say, over this territory, over these three villages, Berezovka, the settlement of Novopoltavka, and this settlement of Tarasovka, then the Russians will be able to secure their flanks completely, and the Ukrainians will lose any possibilities to counterattack. If the Ukrainians counterattack from the north along N32 road, they will be forced to enter this corridor, which is obviously the best, let's say, place to for artillery attacks, and obviously nothing will be able to get even the Russian positions. If the Ukrainians counterattack from this direction, here we can see the same story. The Ukrainians will be forced to enter this short territory through water reservoirs, and the Russians will destroy Ukrainian units with a significant number of artillery strikes. So, as I discussed, this pocket is a perfect position for the Russians to secure their flank, while the main Russian forces advance in the direction of this pocket. Now let's discuss the situation here in details. Today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russian troops managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Rozovka. Ukrainians call this village as Alexandropol. So as you can see, during the previous week, the Russians managed to establish first control over the village of Pantelimonievka, and then to enter the southern outskirts of Valentinovka, and then the Russians finished the battle for the settlement of Rozovka or the settlement of Alexandropol. So we see that the Russians are advancing, the Russians are about to secure the northwestern flank, and as soon as the Russians do this, they will face no barriers to attack deep inside of this pocket with the purpose to get as close as possible to the villages of Alexandra Kalinova, Kliban Bytske water reservoir, and the settlement of Yablunovka. So as we discussed in the previous videos, we believe that the battle for this territory, the battle for the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka arc, is the general battle of 2025. Furthermore, the Russians continue improving their positions in the city of Toretsk and in the area around. Let's discuss first the city of Toretsk. Today we have geolocations that confirm the presence of the Russian forces in additional buildings of the Zabalka micro-district. Today several sources reported that Ukrainians abandoned their positions completely from Zabalka micro-district due to very high risk of being encircled by the Russians during the next several days. Ukrainians returned back to their positions in the village of Shebenovka and the village of Lebedevka, where now the Ukrainians are trying to prepare defense before Russian offensive. The Russians are planning to launch their offensive operation in the direction of these two villages in the very near future. This is the key region before the complete collapse of this Zarya pocket. So once again, we have geolocations from Zabalka that confirm the presence of the armored forces of the Russian Federation in this part. We haven't adjusted the entire Zabalka district, but we believe that during the next several days we will color this territory completely. As for now, the Ukrainians are preparing themselves in these two villages, on the territory of these two villages, because the Ukrainians understand if they lose control over this territory, most likely they're gonna lose control over the entire pocket, and most likely the Russians would be able, on the shoulders of the units of the armored forces of Ukraine, to enter the city of Constantinople from the south. The decisive days are coming for this territory, and maybe Zelensky was correct by saying that the Russians are planning to attack in April, because as for me, everything is ready for this offensive operation. The only question I have is how many soldiers the Ukrainians have in this area with the purpose to stabilize the situation and not to allow the lines to collapse within days. Now let's move further and let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. As for now, the Russians are focused on attacking Ukraine artillery positions, the positions of FPV drone operators in the area between the city of Konstantinovka and the city of Chasiv Yar. As for changes on the ground, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions for the previous 24 hours. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Barova direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As for now, the main clashes are taking place on the line between the settlement of Nadia and the settlement of Raigorodka. This is very important position, this is strategical position, and the Ukrainians see the significant value of this area. The Ukrainians understand that if they can cut the road between Stepi and Raigorodka, then the Ukrainians will be able to cut the supply and support of the Russians in this part of the front line. So this is very important road that Ukrainians are tasked to cut and to take under control. And the Russians show fierce resistance. The Russians counterattack with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to improve their positions. There are very heavy clashes in this area. We have almost every single day another video how another vehicle of the armored forces of Ukraine being destroyed by the Russian fire. So as for now, the initiative doesn't belong to anyone. The clashes continues, and nobody count losses and more forces and reinforcements with the purpose to stabilize the situation or to take the initiative completely. Now let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we received lots of icons from this area. The thing is that Ukrainians during the previous day tried to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to force them to fall back from the settlement of Kondrashovka. Because according to information we have, the Russians took most of Kondrashovka and began fighting for the village of Mala Shapkovka. Taking these villages will allow the Russians to reach the Kupiansk Большой Burluk highway. So this is the highway we are talking about. This is the road that the Russians are trying to cut, and this road, as you can see, goes exactly in the direction of the city of Volchansk, and the Russians are trying to cut this territory, which will lead to complete collapse of logistics in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians, as you can see, tried to counterattack the Russians from almost every single side with the use of the significant number of infantry fighting vehicles, but most of them were destroyed while they were moving towards the Russian positions. The situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians, and currently, according to different sources, the Russians already established complete control over territory inside of this red line. If this information is correct, and if the Russians control this situation, this is already the beginning of the huge disaster for the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of the Kupiansk and Kupiansk agglomeration. Now let's move further. Very interesting details and updates are coming from the village of Kamianka. We have two icons from this area. First icon is the map change of pro-Russian resource. In this video we can see that the Russians managed to establish almost complete control over the southern part of the settlement. Also we have this video where we can see how the Ukrainians more precisely, were attacking the Russian vehicles, artillery systems in the vicinity of Kamianka. And this the next episode, is the most important. Here we can see how the Russian soldiers answered one building that was later attacked by the Ukrainians. This episode took place exactly in this area, and based on this video most of the mappers adjusted their maps in the Russian favor. So basically the Russians initiated the assault operation on the village of Kamianka, and we believe that during the next several days we will color the entire village in the Russian favor. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern direction. Today we got lots of very interesting and sometimes very funny updates. Today, as you know, Zelensky came to Sumy with several purposes. Zelensky recorded a video in Sumy region, which borders Russia's Kursk region. He thanks the remnants of his soldiers who remained in the Kursk region for taking the war back to where it came from. He calls the Kursk offensive one of the greatest Ukrainian achievements during this war. Furthermore, several soldiers, probably who was very grateful to Zelensky that he came to this area, decided to virtually recapture this checkpoint on the border. And here we can see the building that was recently captured by the Russians, with two Ukrainian flags. In this video we can see one flag established on the southern part of the roof, the second one established in the northwestern part of the roof. The sources reported that Ukrainians recaptured this territory and destroyed the Russian contingent on this checkpoint, but in this video we don't see even a single soldier. Later the sources reported that these two flags were established by the Ukrainians with the use of drones. So the Ukrainians carried out this special operation just to show Zelensky that the checkpoint on the border was recaptured by the Ukrainians. So this is interesting situation. The Russians continue their offensive operation. The Russians during the previous 24 hours established or improved their, let's say, blockade of the Ukrainians in Inakivka. In this video we can see how another group of Ukrainian forces was ambushed by the Russians in the vicinity of the settlement. A bit to the south, we received videos how the Russians were attacking and bombing Ukrainian positions with FAP 1500. So we see, despite Zelensky came to Sumy, despite videos with flags established with drones, we see that the Russians continue their preparation before the beginning of another possible offensive operation in the direction of the city of Sumy. So everything is very interesting, and currently nobody knows for sure how exactly the things are going to be developed in the future. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.